Welcome to the Trend Reddit channel. This is where we share interesting, funny, and emotional stories about family life. In a competition that everyone underestimated, an autistic boy exceeded all expectations and astonished the entire audience. What happened when true talent shone? Let's laugh, reflect, and sometimes shed a tear with these meaningful stories. If you love heartfelt and relatable tales, don't forget to hit the subscribe button so you don't miss any of our videos. Be sure to click the notification bell to stay updated on our latest episodes. Thank you for your support and for being with us on Trend Reddit. Henry Parker, a 12-year-old boy with autism, has always stood apart, not just because of his condition but due to his astounding ability in mathematics. From an early age, it became clear that while Henry struggled in many areas of social life, his mind worked with numbers in ways that defied the norm. His father, Daniel Parker, a 35-year-old former construction worker, understood this well. After the tragic death of his wife, Lily, Daniel had become not only Henry's sole caregiver but also his closest companion and unwavering supporter. For Henry, the world outside was overwhelming. Social interactions felt like an intricate puzzle he couldn't solve, with the expectations of others often feeling like impossible equations. He communicated in fragmented sentences, his words coming in fits and starts, and the idea of engaging in any form of conversation often caused him anxiety. At school, Henry was frequently misunderstood and isolated. Other students steered clear of him, not knowing how to connect with someone who seemed so distant, so different. His teachers, while well-meaning, often didn't know how to support him beyond the standard curriculum. Daniel, however, saw past Henry's quiet exterior and into the vast world that existed inside his mind. He knew his son had something extraordinary to offer, even if the rest of the world couldn't yet see it. He had taken on the role of being Henry's guide, advocate, and protector, trying to help his son navigate a world that often judged him before truly understanding him. Life had not been easy for the Parkers. Daniel had given up his construction job to care for Henry full-time after Lily's sudden passing in a car accident when Henry was only 5. They lived modestly, depending on the small income Daniel could make through odd jobs and the help of Henry's grandparents, James and Helen, who, despite their love for Henry, couldn't fully grasp the intricacies of his condition. James, now in his late 60s, would often tell Daniel how boys just need to toughen up, not fully understanding the nature of autism. Helen, on the other hand, would shower Henry with kindness but was just as lost when it came to engaging with him on a deeper level. Their house, a small, weathered bungalow on the outskirts of town, was a place where Henry found comfort. Here, in the confines of his room, with math textbooks scattered across his desk and numbers written on the walls like cryptic codes, Henry thrived. It was a world where everything made sense to him. Numbers were logical, predictable, and comforting. When Henry was solving equations or working through complex mathematical problems, he was in control. The anxieties and fears that plagued him in the outside world seemed to vanish. Daniel, despite his own grief over losing Lily, had found solace in Henry's potential. His days were consumed with ensuring that his son had the tools and opportunities to develop his mathematical skills. Every morning, they would sit together at the kitchen table, the sunlight streaming in through the window, and Daniel would hand Henry a new problem to solve. Henry's eyes would light up as he dove into the task, often finishing in minutes what would take others hours. It was during these moments that Daniel saw the greatness within his son, a greatness that was waiting to be recognized by the world. Though their financial situation was strained, Daniel never allowed his son to feel the weight of their struggles. He was resourceful, making sure Henry always had what he needed, whether it was new math books or the latest educational materials. Yet, deep down, Daniel knew that Henry's talent was far beyond what he could provide at home. His son needed opportunities that Daniel couldn't afford, but he believed in Henry so much that he was willing to find a way. The isolation that Henry experienced at school was a stark contrast to the world Daniel created for him at home. Other children saw him as weird or different, often mocking him behind his back or avoiding him altogether. It broke Daniel's heart to see his son come home, day after day, with no friends to talk to and no invitations to birthday parties. But Daniel was determined not to let the negativity define Henry's future. He knew that while Henry might never be the most popular kid in school, his intellect and talent were gifts that would eventually be recognized, even if it took time. Henry, meanwhile, seemed to accept his isolation with a quiet resilience. He would spend hours at his desk, lost in numbers, while outside, other children played. His world was smaller, but within it, he found satisfaction and contentment. His father's love and belief in him were all he needed to keep going. Daniel had made it clear to Henry that he was special, not in spite of his differences but because of them. For years, this had been their life, quiet, predictable, and filled with the daily routines that brought Henry comfort. But everything changed one rainy afternoon, a day that would set them on a new path neither had expected. As Daniel sat at the kitchen table, a pile of bills spread before him, frustration growing as he tried to make the numbers work, Henry stood beside him, watching silently. Without a word, Henry pointed to a figure on the page and said, "That's wrong." At first, Daniel didn't understand, but when Henry quickly corrected the calculation in his own head, Daniel was stunned. It was in that moment that Daniel truly realized the depth of Henry's gift with numbers. His son wasn't just good at math, he was brilliant. The realization filled Daniel with a mixture of pride and concern. How could he nurture this talent in a world that was often so unforgiving to children like Henry? But one thing was clear, Daniel was going to do everything in his power to make sure Henry had the chance to show the world just how extraordinary he truly was. The rain poured down heavily that afternoon, beating rhythmically against the windows of the small bungalow. Inside, Daniel sat hunched over the kitchen table, a pile of bills and financial statements spread out before him. His brow furrowed in concentration as he tried to make sense of the mounting costs. With every stroke of his pen, frustration built as the numbers refused to align. Money had been tight for years, but recently, it had become nearly unbearable. Each month seemed to bring new challenges, and the strain was becoming more than just financial, it weighed on Daniel's spirit. The quiet house only emphasized the tension in the air. Henry, as usual, was silently observing from a distance. The 12-year-old often watched his father with a mix of curiosity and concern, even though he rarely expressed it verbally. Today, though, something stirred within him. He stood near the doorway, his dark eyes fixed on the pages in front of his father. Despite the autism that made social communication difficult, numbers had always spoken to Henry in a language he understood perfectly. For several minutes, Henry said nothing, his presence almost ghostly in the dim light. Daniel, so wrapped up in his calculations and stress, didn't notice his son inching closer to the table. He sighed heavily, rubbing his temples in defeat as the numbers simply didn't add up. It was then that Henry broke his usual silence. "That's wrong," Henry said in his quiet but clear voice, pointing to a specific figure on the page. Daniel looked up, startled by the interruption. It wasn't that Henry never spoke, but his comments were usually about subjects within his own world, math problems, puzzles, or the occasional observation about patterns. For him to mention something related to the bills was unusual. Daniel blinked, surprised. "What do you mean, buddy?" he asked, his voice laced with both curiosity and exhaustion. Henry didn't hesitate this time. He leaned over the table, his fingers still pointing to the incorrect number. Without any of the hesitation that typically marked his speech, Henry explained, "That calculation is wrong. You subtracted 240 instead of 340. For a moment, Daniel just stared at him, trying to process what had just happened. He looked back at the number in question and then did the math himself. Henry was right. Not just right, perfectly, absolutely correct. Daniel recalculated the figure on his notepad, and it matched Henry's correction exactly. Shocked, Daniel felt a mix of emotions flood through him. On the one hand, the mistake he had made in his calculations seemed almost irrelevant now. On the other, his son, who rarely engaged in day-to-day matters like bills, had just effortlessly spotted and corrected an error that Daniel himself had struggled to find. It wasn't just a small error either, it was a glaring one, and Henry had caught it immediately. Sitting back in his chair, Daniel looked at his son with new eyes. Henry had always been gifted when it came to numbers, but this was the first time Daniel had seen it applied so directly to something in their daily life. He had known Henry was talented. His son's ability to solve math problems faster than any child his age was clear from the start, but the depth of that talent was just now becoming fully apparent. Daniel cleared his throat. "How did you figure that out so quickly?" he asked, genuinely curious. Henry, as was his nature, simply shrugged and said, "I saw it." To him, it was as if the answer had always been there, waiting to be noticed. Numbers made sense to Henry in a way that words and social cues didn't. Where others saw confusion, Henry saw clarity. Realizing the importance of what had just happened, Daniel felt a new sense of urgency stir within him. This wasn't just a lucky guess or a fluke, this was real talent. It was something that needed to be nurtured, even if Daniel wasn't sure how. He stared at the bills on the table, then back at his son. In that brief moment, Daniel saw beyond their financial struggles. He saw a future where Henry's abilities could take him places, far beyond the limitations of their current situation. Henry, sensing his father's lingering gaze, shifted uncomfortably. He wasn't used to attention like this, even from Daniel, and it made him uneasy. "It's just math," he mumbled, looking away, but Daniel wasn't about to let the moment pass. "No, Henry," Daniel said firmly but with a softness that conveyed his pride. "It's not just math. What you did, people don't just see things like that. You've got a gift." Henry didn't respond, but Daniel could see the gears turning in his son's mind. For years, Henry had been living in a world where he was misunderstood and underestimated, but now, Daniel felt like they were on the cusp of something bigger. He didn't know what, exactly, but something inside him told him that this moment was the beginning of a new chapter in their lives. From that day forward, Daniel's approach toward Henry's talents shifted. He no longer saw Henry's gift as something confined to school or the privacy of their home. This was something that could, and should, be shared with the world. The realization filled Daniel with a new sense of purpose. If Henry could spot a mistake so easily in something as mundane as bills, what could he achieve in a place designed for minds like his? For the first time in years, Daniel felt a flicker of hope amidst the overwhelming burden of their circumstances. In the weeks following that fateful afternoon, Daniel began to notice a shift in their daily routine. What had once been a quiet, predictable life centered around Henry's comfort now took on a more intentional rhythm. Every morning, after their usual breakfast of cereal and toast, Daniel would sit down with Henry, armed with a fresh set of math problems. The exercises started simply enough: basic algebra, geometry, and mental math, but as the days went by, it became clear that Henry needed more of a challenge. His ability to process complex equations and abstract concepts outpaced anything Daniel could provide. One afternoon, while running errands at the local grocery store, something caught Daniel's eye. Pinned to the community bulletin board was a brightly colored flyer for the National Junior Mathematics Competition. It was a prestigious event, drawing the best young minds in the country. Daniel's hand hovered over the flyer, hesitation gnawing at him. Competing in such a public forum would be daunting for any child, let alone one who struggled as much as Henry did with social interaction. Could Henry really stand on a stage and solve problems in front of a crowd? Could he handle the pressure? Still, Daniel felt a pull. His son had a gift, and hiding it away from the world didn't feel right. Returning home, the flyer now tucked into his jacket pocket, he mulled over the idea for days before finally deciding to broach the subject with Henry. That evening, as they worked on their usual puzzles at the kitchen table, Daniel casually slid the flyer across the table. "What do you think about this?" he asked, his voice calm but measured. Henry glanced at the paper, then back at his father. His brow furrowed slightly, a common expression when something unfamiliar or uncomfortable was introduced. "A competition?" Henry muttered, his tone more curious than apprehensive. Daniel nodded. "Yeah, it's a math competition. It's a big one, but I think you could do really well. You're better at this than most kids, Henry." Henry didn't respond immediately. He looked down at the flyer, his fingers tracing the edges, but his mind seemed to be elsewhere, processing the idea. Daniel knew not to push too hard. Henry needed time to absorb things in his own way. After a long pause, Henry said, "I don't like people watching." It was a simple statement, but it carried the weight of 1,000 anxieties. Daniel's heart sank a little, but he wasn't ready to give up. "I know," Daniel said softly. "But I'll be with you every step of the way. We can take it slow, start with some smaller competitions. You don't have to decide right now. If you find it interesting, please like it. If not, please comment number 1. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this video." And so, they did. Over the next few weeks, Daniel entered Henry into local and regional math contests. These were smaller venues, classrooms, libraries, community centers, but they served as practice grounds for Henry. At first, Henry's anxiety was palpable. He would freeze up at the sight of even a small audience, his hands shaking as he struggled to focus on the problems in front of him. But with each contest, something began to change. Henry found a way to center himself amidst the chaos, tuning out the crowd and zeroing in on the numbers that had always brought him comfort. In those early competitions, Henry rarely spoke beyond answering the math problems, but he didn't need to. His brilliance shone through in the precision of his answers and the speed at which he solved complex equations. Other parents and contestants would watch in amazement as Henry breezed through problems that left others stumped. Whispers circulated through the crowds about the quiet boy who did math like a machine. Yet, despite his growing success, Henry remained withdrawn, retreating into himself once the contests were over. One day, after a particularly intense regional competition where Henry had placed first, Daniel watched him from the sidelines. The pride he felt was immense, but so too was the growing worry about how they could sustain this. Traveling to competitions wasn't cheap, and the entry fees were adding up. They were scraping by as it was, and Daniel didn't want their financial struggles to become a barrier for Henry's future. Determined not to let money stand in the way, Daniel reached out to the local community. He wrote letters, made phone calls, and even posted about Henry's achievements on social media, hoping for support. At first, the response was lukewarm. People were intrigued by the story of Henry's talent, but not enough to take action. Yet, as the weeks went by, word began to spread. Parents, teachers, and even local businesses started to rally behind the cause. Donations trickled in, small amounts at first, but enough to cover travel costs and entry fees for the upcoming national competition. With the community's support, Daniel and Henry continued to push forward. The more they prepared, the more Daniel realized just how far Henry had come. Not only was Henry excelling in math, but he was also beginning to manage his anxiety in public spaces. It wasn't easy, every competition still brought with it a wave of nerves, but Henry was learning how to cope. And Daniel, always by his side, offered quiet words of encouragement when needed, knowing that his son's greatest strength lay in his ability to persevere. As the national competition approached, there was a palpable sense of anticipation. The stakes were higher than ever, and the pressure was mounting, but Daniel believed in his son more than ever. Henry, too, seemed ready in his own quiet way. The numbers were his refuge, and as long as he had them, he could navigate anything that came his way. They packed their bags and boarded the bus that would take them to the city where the national competition was being held. Henry sat quietly, staring out the window, his thoughts a mystery as the world passed by. Daniel, sitting beside him, placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. They had come so far together, and now the moment of truth was fast approaching. Whatever happened next, Daniel knew that Henry had already achieved more than anyone had ever expected. The national competition hall buzzed with activity. Students, parents, and judges filled the space, their chatter echoing off the high ceilings. It was a grand venue, much larger and more intimidating than the local competitions Henry had become accustomed to. Daniel glanced at his son, who sat quietly in the chair beside him, his hands folded tightly in his lap. Henry's face was calm, but Daniel knew him well enough to sense the tension underneath. The first round of the competition was a written test, a series of complex problems designed to weed out the weaker contestants. Henry, though nervous, handled this round with his usual precision. His pencil moved swiftly over the paper, each stroke confident and deliberate. When he finished, he placed the pencil down and waited, his eyes fixed on the table in front of him. Daniel watched from the sidelines, his heart swelling with pride. His son was extraordinary, and every moment like this reminded him just how far they had come. When the results of the first round were posted, Henry had advanced easily to the second round. A quiet sense of accomplishment settled over both of them, but Daniel knew the real challenge was yet to come. The second round was a live problem-solving challenge, the part of the competition that Daniel had dreaded the most. Henry's social anxiety always spiked when he had to perform in front of an audience, and this round would be no different. The task wasn't just to solve a problem, it was to explain the solution aloud, in front of the judges and the crowd. For Henry, who preferred the solitude of his mind, this was an almost unimaginable challenge. When Henry's name was called, Daniel felt his breath catch in his throat. Henry stood slowly, his face pale but determined. He walked to the front of the room, his eyes cast downward, avoiding the stares of the audience. Daniel, from his seat, silently willed his son to stay calm, to remember everything they had practiced. Henry stood before the judges, the chalkboard behind him blank and waiting. The judges presented him with a complex equation, a problem that required not only mathematical skill but also the ability to think on his feet. Henry looked at the problem for a moment, his expression unreadable. For what felt like an eternity, he didn't move. His hand hovered over the chalk, his breathing shallow. The room grew painfully quiet, the audience watching with bated breath. Daniel's heart pounded in his chest. He had seen Henry freeze up like this before, during the smaller competitions, but this was different. The stakes were higher, and the pressure was palpable. From the sidelines, Daniel leaned forward slightly, his voice barely a whisper, "You've got this, Henry." It was as if Henry heard him across the distance. His fingers tightened around the piece of chalk, and slowly, he began to write. At first, his hand trembled, the chalk squeaking slightly against the board. The room remained silent, but Henry's focus began to sharpen. As he started explaining his thought process, his voice was quiet and hesitant, but with each word, it grew stronger. The audience listened intently as Henry laid out the solution, step by step, his voice gaining confidence. Daniel watched in awe as his son, who had always struggled to express himself verbally, now articulated the complexities of the equation with clarity. The tension in the room began to lift as the crowd shifted from doubt to admiration. Henry's explanation, though unpolished, was brilliant in its simplicity. The judges exchanged glances, clearly impressed. As Henry finished, he stepped back from the board, his hands now steady. The solution was complete, and it was correct. The judges nodded approvingly, and the audience erupted into applause. Daniel, overcome with emotion, clapped the hardest, pride swelling in his chest. Henry stood there for a moment, blinking at the sound of the applause, as if unsure whether it was meant for him. But there was no doubt, Henry had conquered the second round, a feat that Daniel had once thought impossible. The boy who had struggled so much with public speaking had just demonstrated his genius in front of a crowd. It wasn't just about the math anymore, it was about overcoming the barriers that had held Henry back for so long. For the first time, Daniel saw not just a math prodigy but a boy who was beginning to break free of the limitations others had placed on him. As Henry returned to his seat, his face still pale but with a faint hint of pride, Daniel leaned over and whispered, "You did it, buddy." Henry nodded slightly, still processing everything that had just happened, but Daniel could see the flicker of realization in his son's eyes. He had done something remarkable. The competition wasn't over yet, though. Henry had made it to the final round, the ultimate challenge that would determine the winner. The atmosphere in the hall shifted as the remaining contestants prepared for the final task. Daniel could feel the tension rise once again, but this time, he wasn't afraid. Henry had already proven so much, not just to the judges but to himself. When the final round began, the pressure was unlike anything Henry had faced before. The math problems were even more complex, and the time constraints were tighter. But Henry, now more composed, approached the task with the quiet confidence he had earned. His competitors, though skilled, couldn't keep up with his pace. Daniel watched from the sidelines, his heart in his throat, as Henry worked through the final problem. The audience, now fully invested in the quiet boy's journey, watched in awe as he solved the problem with ease. When the last number was written on the board, and the judges declared him the winner, the room erupted once again in applause. Henry Parker, the boy who had once been too shy to speak in public, had just won the National Junior Mathematics competition. As the applause thundered through the competition hall, Henry stood still, his face unreadable, as if trying to make sense of everything happening around him. Daniel, his heart swelling with pride, rushed forward to meet his son. The other contestants, judges, and spectators continued to clap, their admiration for the young prodigy evident in their smiles and whispers. Daniel knelt beside Henry, his hand resting on his son's shoulder, a smile breaking through the emotions welling inside him. "You did it, Henry," Daniel whispered, his voice shaking slightly. Henry glanced up at his father, his eyes wide, still processing the weight of the moment. For someone like Henry, who had spent much of his life isolated and misunderstood, this public validation was monumental. But, true to his nature, he remained calm on the outside, though Daniel could sense the quiet pride beneath his surface. The judges approached them, their expressions filled with both admiration and respect. One judge, a tall man with silver hair and glasses perched low on his nose, extended his hand to Henry. "You've done something remarkable today, young man," he said warmly. "Your solution to the final problem was brilliant. We don't often see such a combination of talent and composure in someone so young." Henry hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to react to the compliment, before he slowly shook the judge's hand. Daniel beamed, his pride for his son boundless. He had always believed in Henry's abilities, but seeing the world recognize his son's brilliance was more fulfilling than anything he had ever imagined. After the formalities of the award ceremony, the hall began to empty as contestants and their families headed home. Henry, still processing everything, remained close to his father, not saying much. His mind was likely whirling with the events of the day, the crowd, the attention, things that had always overwhelmed him before. But this time, he had faced it all head-on and come out victorious. Outside, the evening air was cool and refreshing as they walked toward the bus stop. Daniel couldn't stop smiling, though he kept his excitement tempered, knowing Henry would need time to decompress after the intensity of the competition. He glanced at his son, who was walking beside him in his usual quiet way. "You know," Daniel began, his tone casual, "you didn't just win the competition today. You proved something to yourself." Henry didn't respond right away, but after a few moments, he nodded slightly. It wasn't just the numbers or the equations that had mattered today, it was the fact that he had stood up in front of a crowd, pushed through his anxieties, and shown the world what he was capable of. In many ways, it was a victory over the barriers that had always seemed insurmountable. As they reached the bus stop, Daniel noticed a group of people from their community gathered there, waiting to congratulate them. These were the people who had helped fund their journey to the national competition, local business owners, neighbors, even some teachers from Henry's school. They had all chipped in to make sure Henry had the chance to compete, and now, they were eager to celebrate his success. One of the neighbors, Mrs. Jenkins, an older woman with kind eyes, stepped forward and hugged Daniel. "We're so proud of you both," she said warmly. "Henry has shown us all what determination looks like." Henry, slightly uncomfortable with the attention, stood by quietly, his hands in his pockets, while Daniel thanked everyone for their support. As the group continued to express their pride and joy for Henry's achievement, Daniel noticed his son retreating slightly into himself, as he often did when overwhelmed. Knowing how much the day had taken out of him, Daniel gently placed a hand on Henry's shoulder. "It's been a big day," he said softly. "Why don't we head home?" Henry nodded, clearly relieved. The bus ride back to their small town was quiet, the landscape passing by as the sky turned from dusk to dark. Daniel, sitting beside Henry, reflected on how much had changed in such a short time. Just a few months ago, the idea of Henry standing in front of a room full of people and speaking was unimaginable. Now, he had not only done that but had also won a national competition. As the bus pulled into the station near their neighborhood, Daniel looked at his son, whose head was resting against the window, eyes closed but not asleep. "You've earned this, Henry," Daniel said, though he wasn't sure if Henry was listening. "And this is just the beginning." The following day, life returned to its usual rhythm. The house was quiet again, just the way Henry liked it. But something was different. There was a new sense of confidence in the air. Henry, while still reserved and introverted, seemed lighter, as if the weight of his anxieties had lessened, even if just a little. A few days later, a letter arrived in the mail. It was addressed to Henry, something that rarely happened. Daniel opened it carefully, scanning the contents before looking up at his son. "Henry," he called out, holding the letter in his hand. "You've been offered a scholarship." Henry appeared at the doorway, his brow furrowing in curiosity. "A scholarship?" he asked quietly. Daniel nodded, smiling. "To a prestigious math academy. It's a big deal. They want you to study there, with other kids who love math as much as you do." Henry looked at the letter, his expression thoughtful. For someone like him, who thrived in solitude and in the safety of his routines, the idea of leaving home for a new environment was daunting. But the opportunity was undeniable. "We can go visit," Daniel said, sensing his son's hesitation. "See what it's like. You don't have to decide right away." Henry nodded slowly, his mind already working through the possibilities. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, he felt ready to step into it, even if it meant leaving the comfort of the world he had always known. A few days later, Daniel and Henry took a trip to visit the prestigious math academy. The school was located in a quiet, leafy neighborhood on the outskirts of the city, far from the familiar surroundings of their small town. As they drove through the tree-lined streets leading up to the academy, Daniel couldn't help but feel a mixture of excitement and anxiety. He glanced at Henry, who was gazing out of the car window, his expression unreadable. The campus itself was impressive, with modern buildings and sprawling lawns that seemed to stretch endlessly. It was the kind of place that offered countless opportunities, and Daniel could see the potential it held for Henry. Still, he knew that the decision to attend this school wasn't going to be easy for his son. Henry had always thrived in the comfort of familiar surroundings, and leaving home for a new environment might be overwhelming for him. As they parked and stepped out of the car, they were greeted by one of the academy's administrators, a middle-aged woman with a warm smile who introduced herself as Ms. Green. "We're so excited to have you here, Henry," she said, her tone genuine. "We've heard amazing things about your talent." Henry nodded politely, but his eyes wandered around the campus, taking in the vastness of it all. Ms. Green led them on a tour of the school, showing them the classrooms, the library, and the impressive mathematics department where students worked on advanced problems that would challenge even seasoned mathematicians. Everywhere they went, students bustled around, engaged in discussions and collaborative projects. It was a place where Henry's talents could truly flourish. Daniel observed his son carefully during the tour. Henry's face remained calm, but Daniel could see the gears turning in his mind, weighing the pros and cons of this new opportunity. At one point, Ms. Green showed them the dormitory where Henry would stay if he decided to enroll. The room was small but cozy, with a view of the campus gardens. Henry stood at the window, staring out at the trees swaying gently in the breeze. After the tour, Ms. Green invited them to sit in her office to discuss the details of the scholarship and what life at the academy would be like for Henry. Daniel listened attentively as she outlined the support system in place for students with special needs, including those on the autism spectrum. "We have a strong network of counselors and teachers who are experienced in helping students like Henry adjust to life here," she assured them. "We know that it can be a big transition, but we're committed to making sure every student feels supported." Henry listened quietly, his hands resting on his lap, his gaze focused on the floor. Daniel could sense the internal struggle his son was going through. On one hand, this school represented an incredible opportunity for Henry to grow and explore his mathematical potential in ways that would never be possible back home. On the other hand, it meant stepping out of his comfort zone, leaving behind the familiarity of their small house, his routines, and the quiet life they had built together. After the meeting, they thanked Ms. Green and headed back to the car. As they drove home, the silence between them felt heavy with unspoken thoughts. Daniel didn't want to pressure Henry into making a decision, but he also wanted his son to understand just how important this opportunity was. That evening, after they returned home, Daniel found Henry sitting at the kitchen table, a familiar scene that had played out countless times over the years. But this time, Henry wasn't working on math problems. Instead, he was staring at the acceptance letter from the academy, deep in thought. Daniel sat down across from him, waiting for Henry to speak first. After a few moments, Henry looked up. "Do you think I should go?" he asked quietly. Daniel took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "I think this could be a great opportunity for you, Henry. You have a gift, and this school could help you take it even further. But I also know it's a big change, and it's not something you have to decide right away. It's your choice." Henry nodded, processing his father's words. He knew that staying home would be easier, safer, but a part of him also understood that the academy offered him something that staying at home never could, a chance to challenge himself, to grow, and to be surrounded by people who truly understood and appreciated his talents. The following morning, Henry made his decision. As they sat down for breakfast, he looked at Daniel and said, "I want to go. I think I'm ready." Daniel's heart swelled with pride, but he kept his emotions in check, knowing that this was Henry's moment. "I'm proud of you, Henry," he said softly. "We'll make sure everything is ready." Over the next few weeks, they prepared for Henry's transition to the academy. There were forms to fill out, supplies to buy, and countless logistical details to sort through. Through it all, Daniel remained calm and supportive, knowing that his son was taking a brave step into the unknown. When the day finally came for Henry to move into the dormitory, Daniel drove him to the academy, the car packed with Henry's belongings. The ride was quiet, both of them lost in their thoughts. As they pulled up to the dormitory, Daniel helped Henry carry his things inside. The room looked exactly as they had seen it on the tour, but now it was filled with Henry's personal items, his math books, his notebooks, his favorite puzzles. After everything was unpacked, Daniel stood in the doorway, watching Henry settle into the room. For the first time, he realized that his son was no longer the quiet, anxious boy who had struggled to fit into the world around him. Henry had grown into a young man with incredible talent and the courage to pursue his dreams, no matter how difficult the path might be. "I'll see you soon, okay?" Daniel said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. Henry nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. "Thanks, Dad." As Daniel walked back to the car, he felt a deep sense of peace. Henry was ready for this new chapter, and though the road ahead would be challenging, Daniel knew that his son would continue to defy the odds, just as he had done so many times before. Thank you for listening. See you in the next episode. Take care of yourself and your loved ones. Goodbye.